Now, I'm not one to gossip, but I will bring you the tea. Welcome to Chronicle Speaks.
Please, I don't have any time for any gossip now. Eh? Yes.
Look at you.
Now, you all may remember a lawsuit between Ashley Parham and Diddy. Now, I covered it on my channel a few months ago and it sparked mixed reactions. Some of you thought it was too outrageous, while others said you can't really put anything past Diddy. Now, can you? Now, in the lawsuit, Parham alleged that she was drugged and gang-arded by Diddy and members of his entourage at a private home in the Bay Area in 2018. Now, after the alleged attack, she said she slashed Diddy with a knife and someone pow-powed in her direction before she narrowly escaped with her life. Now she has filed an amended complaint, and in this complaint she is adding Diddy's mama, big homie CC, the bodyguard, Jaguar Wright, aka Jaguar Wright, Druski, Odell Beckham, and many others. We are going to find out what links these celebrities to Diddy in this case. But before we do that, please be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell for notification so you don't miss out on any news regarding this story and so much more. Now let's get back into it. Now Miss Ashley Parham is filing this lawsuit with John and Jane Doe, known together as the plaintiffs. Now they're filing their lawsuit against Sean P. Diddy Combs, Christina Coram, also known as KK, Shane Pierce, Ruben Valdez, John Pelletier, Odell Beckham Jr., Druski, Jaguar Wright, Helena Harris Scott, Matthias Gonzalez, Brandy Cunningham, Janice Combs, Keith Lux, also known as Big Homie CC, and John and Jane Doe's 1 through 10. Together, they're known as the defendants. Now, this case involves RICO enterprise for the purpose of as assault, battery, or as abuse, false imprisonment, and kidnapping for the personal and financial benefits to the enterprise participants. Defendant Diddy has been sued by countless individuals for crimes similar to the ones enumerated in this complaint. Defendant Diddy is currently a federal inmate awaiting criminal trial for crimes similar to the ones enumerated in this complaint. Defendant KK is an employee of Defendant Diddy, often referred to by Defendant Diddy as his right-hand woman. Defendant Diddy's predatory behavior was consistent and was well known by several individuals, including Defendant Diddy's employees, staff, friends, family, and associates. In fact, Defendant Diddy's sons are being sued for engaging in the same types of deviant behavior as their father, as pled in a Los Angeles Superior Court filing. Defendant Diddy was able to effectuate his crimes and evade capture and prosecution for his crimes for almost 30 years due to his position of power and influence in the entertainment industry. Defendant Diddy exploited his position and his relationships with powerful individuals to force sexual acts through exploitation, fear, manipulation, physical threats, emotional abuse, intimidation, and retaliation. Had any of the previous victims of Defendant Diddy been taken seriously, or had any of the abettors reported Defendant Diddy's action to law enforcement, Defendant Diddy's illegal and unfathomable behavior could have been prevented. Instead, Defendant Diddy was able to rain his abuse and terrorism on countless victims for over 30 years. Additionally, had Defendant Diddy's numerous business partners and associates not ignored Defendant Diddy's deviant behavior, Defendant Diddy would have been unable to continue his pattern of abuse over such a long period of time. As alleged herein, Defendant Diddy abused his power of position in the entertainment industry to garner loyalty and trust from the public at large and law enforcement, while instilling fear and intimidation in the hearts of his voluminous victims. Allegations against Defendant Diddy have been disregarded for decades, therefore creating a failure to protect victims like the plaintiffs named herein. Unlike most victims of Defendant Diddy, who were employees, sex workers, or individuals seeking out defendant to help launch their careers, Plaintiff Parham does not fall into any of those categories. Plaintiff Parham met Defendant Diddy due to happenstance and still ended up being brutally victimized in a similar manner as described by the others who have preceded her filings and others who surely will follow, including Plaintiff Doe's herein. Plaintiffs John and Jane Doe met with Defendant Diddy through their connections in the music industry, as Plaintiff John Doe was a previous plaintiff against Michael Jackson for assault as a minor. Due to Defendant Diddy's agreement to participate in a corrupt enterprise, plaintiff and countless other victims have been immeasurably and permanently harmed. Plaintiffs allege as follows upon personal knowledge as to themselves and their own acts and experience, and as to all other manners upon information and belief, including investigations conducted by their attorneys. Now, we've gone over Ashley Parham's complaint before, but this time the amended complaint complaint includes Jaguar Wright, Druski, Big Homie CC, Odell Beckham Jr. So we're going to see how all of them link to this story regarding Ashley Parham and Diddy.
Do I need to bring the receipts, baby girl? Because I got receipts.
I'm letting you know right now this document is very long, but we are going to get down to the nitty gritty of it. So if you don't want to hear me reading,
shut up.
Plaintiff met defendant Shane in February 2018 after an altercation with another man at a bar, and defendant Shane came to plaintiff's rescue. While outside the bar with friends and other patrons, defendant Shane FaceTime video called defendant Diddy and was showing people defendant Diddy in the video on his phone, attempting to impress the people with his famous friend. Defendant Shane then showed plaintiff defendant Diddy on the video call, which plaintiff ignored, stating she was not impressed by him knowing defendant Diddy because she believed defendant Diddy had something to do with the murder of rapper Tupac Shakur. Visible in the FaceTime call was defendant Diddy and some of his children, including his sons Christian and Quincy. It appears from the plaintiff's perspective, defendant Diddy was having a get-together at his home during the time of the FaceTime call with defendant Shane. Defendant Diddy heard plaintiff's statement and made a remark that plaintiff would pay for her statement regarding Tupac and overall dismissal of defendant Diddy. On March 23, 2018, defendant Shane invited plaintiff over to his home to assist him with his cancer medication because he stated he was weak and unable to open his medications. Upon plaintiff's arrival, defendant Shane informed plaintiff that he wanted to give her a ride in his new car. Plaintiff and defendant Shane left his residence for a brief period and then returned. Once they returned, defendant Shane left the door to his apartment partially open and stated that the door was ajar because there was an issue with the door where it couldn't close completely. Defendant Shane was renting an apartment on the lower floor of a home in Orinda, California. Defendant Shane had a separate entrance into his residence that led to the backyard of the home. The home also had a main entrance on Loma Vista Drive. Defendant Shane rented the home from a woman who lived in the upstairs portion of the home and had two dogs who resided with her. Plaintiff and defendant Shane then began to watch a movie, and defendant Shane offered her a glass of water, which he retrieved and brought back to plaintiff. Approximately 10 minutes after plaintiff and defendant Shane returned from their drive, defendant Diddy entered defendant Shane's residence. Defendant Diddy entered the home in a grand, ready-to-party manner. His grandiose entrance was so loud that the dogs upstairs began barking. Defendant Diddy did not enter the home through the backyard entrance, but instead through the main entrance. Along with defendant Diddy were his bodyguards, defendant Big Homie CC, defendant KK, which is also known as Christina Coram, defendant Brandy, defendant Doe number 2, who upon information and belief is a friend of defendant Shane and defendant Diddy, and defendant Diddy's driver, Doe number 3, who remained outside and in his vehicle during the duration of plaintiff's assault. Plaintiff believes defendant Shane invited her to set her up to be assaulted by defendant Diddy because of the statement she made about defendant Diddy a month prior. Upon defendant Diddy's arrival, he immediately began to antagonize the plaintiff, stating that she thought she would never see him in person, pay for her statements about Tupac during the video call, and that defendant Diddy caught plaintiff. Plaintiff was in shock as she never believed that she would ever see or meet defendant Diddy in real life, let alone in the small apartment rented by defendant Shane. Defendant Diddy then began advancing towards where plaintiff was sitting on defendant Shane's bed with a knife and held it right to the side of plaintiff's face and threatened to give her a Glasgow smile in retaliation for her previous statements on the video call. Defendant KK, Christina Coram, told defendant Diddy that she did not think that giving plaintiff a Glasgow smile would be advantageous to their potential clients who they could sell plaintiff for sex to. Defendant KK then made a threat to plaintiff that she could ship her off anywhere in the world and that she would never see her family or anyone she knew ever again. Defendant Shane then partially undressed plaintiff, then defendant Diddy removed the remainder of plaintiff's clothing, removing the knife from her face and then retrieving a bottle of liquid from a large fanny pack. Defendant Diddy then squirted a bottle of liquid on plaintiff, which placed her in fear that she was being squirted with a chemical substance like acid. Plaintiff soon realized the substance was an oil lubricant. Plaintiff was squirted with this liquid substance over the entirety of her naked body. Defendant KK, Christina Coram, was then told by defendant Diddy to insert what looked like a syringe from sterile packaging into plaintiff's feminine region. Defendant KK did as told while assisted by defendant Brandy, and then told defendant Diddy that they were unable to use the IUD because it had prematurely been released from its packaging. Defendant Diddy, upset by this, took the syringe from defendant KK and tried inserting it in plaintiff's feminine region instead. Defendant KK and Diddy began to argue as defendant KK continued to advise defendant Diddy that since the IUD had been prematurely released from its packaging, it was no way they could insert it into plaintiff's feminine region effectively. After some time, defendant Diddy heeded the advice of defendant KK and removed the syringe from plaintiff's feminine region and handed it to defendant KK. Defendant KK and defendant Brandy then exited defendant Shane's residence, leaving plaintiff alone with defendants Diddy, Shane, and John Doe's, who have been named herein. Defendant Diddy then picked up a television remote that was near plaintiff and violently inserted it into plaintiff's female regions. Defendant Diddy, while violently eyeing plaintiff with the television remote, told plaintiff that her life was in his hands and that if he wanted, he could take her and she would never be seen again. Plaintiff began hysterically crying from the threats by defendant Diddy, along with the pain of being violently arred in her feminine region by defendant Diddy with the television remote, as well as the lingering pain from the ordeal with the IUD syringe insertion. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Shane to turn plaintiff on her stomach, seemingly tired of hearing the plaintiff blood-curdling cries. Defendant Shane then grabbed plaintiff by her abdomen and hips and turned plaintiff on her stomach. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Shane to put a pillow over her head because he didn't want to see her face or hear her cries, and instructed plaintiff Shane to take advantage of plaintiff from her backside. Defendant Shane did as he was told by defendant Diddy and began to take advantage of plaintiff's backside. Defendant Diddy then violently arred plaintiff by her backside as well after defendant Shane. Defendant Doe number 2 then joined defendant Diddy and Shane, taking turns taking advantage of plaintiff's backside. Immediately after defendant Doe number 2 took advantage of plaintiff, he exited defendant Shane's residence. Defendant Diddy then instructed another defendant Doe to also take advantage of plaintiff. Defendant Doe has been determined to be defendant Druski. Instead of immediately taking advantage of plaintiff, defendant Druski doused plaintiff with more oil/lubricant and then jumped on top of plaintiff's naked and oiled body, treating it like a slip and slide and knocking the wind out of plaintiff due to his enormous size. Defendant Druski then caught himself from sliding over plaintiff's oiled body and off the bed. He then began taking advantage of plaintiff's feminine region. While defendant Druski was taking advantage of plaintiff, defendant Diddy sat in a chair near the bed and began to pleasure himself while recording plaintiff's R by defendant Druski. Another party's phone fell on the bed near plaintiff. Plaintiff then attempted to grab the phone, but it slipped out of her hands and onto the floor due to the oil/lubricant that had been doused all over her person by defendants Diddy and Druski. Defendant Diddy began laughing at plaintiff's attempt to grab the phone. Throughout the violent gang R, defendant Diddy made constant belittling remarks to plaintiff, including that he owned her now. At some point during this ordeal, plaintiff remembers defendants referring to another defendant Doe as Cornelius and remembers the name because it was so odd and unique. Plaintiff has come to discover that defendant Doe Cornelius, who arred her, was defendant Odell. Plaintiff's body was becoming more and more limp over the course of the violent R until eventually she had no control over her body, nor could she move her body. While defendant Druski finished arring plaintiff, defendant KK entered the room to examine the condition of plaintiff, who was barely able to move or control her bodily functions. Defendant KK examined plaintiff to see if she needed assistance and was about to give plaintiff an IV fluid. Plaintiff could not be certain if she did or did not receive such intravenous intervention. Defendant KK then opened a different bag, different from the one defendant Diddy removed the oil from, where plaintiff observed several medicine bottles, IV fluid bags, and other unidentifiable powder-like drugs. Defendant KK then removed a pill from one of the medicine bottles and gave it to defendant Diddy. Defendant Diddy then inserted the pill into plaintiff's mouth and down her throat to where plaintiff had no choice but to ingest the unknown pill. Defendants Diddy, Shane, KK, Odell, and Druski then exited the residence to the backyard where they smoked marijuana and cigarettes. Plaintiff remained in an almost lifeless state in defendant Shane's bedroom until she finally regained her bodily functions. Plaintiff began looking for her clothes in her purse that contained her car keys and her cell phone, but could not discover them in the room or anywhere in the apartment. Plaintiff was only able to find a t-shirt on the floor, which she put on to cover her naked body. Plaintiff also observed a black condom wrapper on the floor of the bedroom, which she assumed was used by one of the defendants, most likely defendant Diddy, during the R. Plaintiff then found a knife with the assistance of the Doe's plaintiffs and headed to the backyard where the defendants were smoking, as that was the only way to exit the premises onto the street. Plaintiff concealed the knife on her left side as she exited the apartment to the backyard area. Upon coming to the exit of the home, which led to the backyard, plaintiff was met met by defendant's big homie CC, who was standing at the door between the residence and the backyard. By the time plaintiff was able to compose herself and come to the backyard, defendant KK was no longer in the backyard, but upstairs on the patio balcony with defendant Brandy. Defendant Doe allowed plaintiff to walk to the backyard where defendants were still smoking. Defendant Doe did not see the knife that plaintiff concealed on her left side, as it was obstructed by the oversized t-shirt plaintiff was wearing. Plaintiff observed defendant Diddy still partially nude from the assault, while the other defendants had on their clothing. Defendant Shane then left to the upstairs portion of the patio balcony where defendant KK and Brandy were already situated. Plaintiff then sat down on the makeshift seat in the backyard when defendant Diddy noticed her presence and remarked that he was surprised she was still able to walk because he had given her enough drugs to take out a horse. Plaintiff then asked Diddy what he gave her, and he laughed and did not provide a response. Defendant Diddy then made further comments to plaintiff in a jovial, friendly manner, asking why they hadn't partied together before because it was so much fun and he hadn't had any ass that tight in a while. Defendant big homie CC then quipped at defendant Diddy that he probably hadn't had ass that tight because he's not used to having backside sex with women, which defendant Diddy and Doe laughed at. Plaintiff then told defendant Diddy she did not party with him and she did not enjoy partying with him and that he R-ed her. Defendant Diddy did not like plaintiff's response to his lighthearted commentary and offered plaintiff money and instructed plaintiff to say that the violent R was consensual and that plaintiff was a sex worker. Plaintiff became enraged and yelled at defendant Diddy that her R was not consensual and that she was not a sex worker, and she refused to take any money from him and would tell the police that he had R-ed her. Defendant Diddy then told plaintiff no one would ever believe she had been R-ed by him, and if she did tell anyone such, that they would harm her family. Defendant big homie CC then showed plaintiff his phone, which looked as if it was outside of plaintiff's estranged sister's residence, as she could see her sister sitting on a couch and her sister's spouse on the balcony. It looked as if someone was outside the residence streaming this video to defendant big homie CC's phone. Plaintiff, while still rattled by what she was seeing on defendant big homie CC's phone, was still angry about being gang R-ed and was not complying with defendant Diddy's request to take the money being offered to say that the R was consensual. Defendant Diddy then called defendant Janice in an effort to further convince plaintiff not to report her assault. Defendant Janice yelled at plaintiff to not hurt her son. Plaintiff told Janice that her son had violently R-ed plaintiff. Defendant Janice, seemingly unfazed by the statement, then continued her demand with plaintiff to take the money being offered and not report the R to law enforcement. Defendant Diddy then made further threats that he had gotten off from bigger crimes than this and referred to Tupac again, further antagonizing plaintiff. Defendant big homie CC turned to defendant Diddy and pulled his pow-pow on him, asking him to repeat what he had said in reference to Tupac. As the two of them were exchanging words, plaintiff went behind defendant big homie CC, where he seemingly began to protect plaintiff. Defendant big homie CC then advanced to defendant Diddy, questioning him over the comments he made about Tupac. During this commotion, a neighbor directly across the street came outside and peered into the backyard and asked what all of the commotion was about. Defendant big homie CC then pointed his pow-pow at the neighbor and instructed him to mind his business and return to his residence. Defendant big homie CC then turned the pow-pow back on defendant Diddy. Plaintiff, not far behind defendant big homie CC, tried to grab defendant big homie CC's hand that had the pow-pow. The pow-pow then went off and hit the hill behind defendant Shane's residence. Defendant Diddy then ran up the back stone stairs near the hill in the backyard towards where defendant KK, Shane, and Brandy were. Plaintiff charged towards defendant Diddy, moving the concealed knife from her left hand to her right hand and in pursuit of defendant Diddy. Plaintiff then pushed defendant Diddy from behind while on the stone stairs outside, causing him to fall with his back to plaintiff. Plaintiff then raised the knife in a rage from the events that just transpired and with the intent of driving the knife into defendant Diddy's back when he turned around and began pleading for his life. Plaintiff, shocked now to see defendant Diddy acting as a victim, had a moment of clarity and then turned and ran down the outdoor stone staircase back out to the backyard to escape. Defendant Diddy then chased plaintiff down the stairs and attempted to push her, but she was already at the bottom of the stairs and gained her footing and wielded the knife at defendant Diddy, grazing his abdomen. Hearing the commotion, defendant KK and Brandy emerged, and defendant KK then administered first aid to defendant Diddy for the injuries caused by plaintiff. Plaintiff tried to make a quick dash for the exit, but it was thwarted by another defendant, Doe. After a period of time, plaintiff was able to abscond from defendant Doe due to the first aid commotion with defendant Diddy and was able to run down the street. Once plaintiff made it onto the street, she began yelling loudly for someone to call the police. Defendant Doe, who had now caught up with plaintiff, advised plaintiff that he was an undercover cop. To this day, plaintiff is unsure of the truth or falsity of that statement. The same neighbor then again emerged from his residence asking what was transpiring. Just as plaintiff was attempting to answer, gunshots began being fired in plaintiff's direction. Plaintiff fled to a car near where the neighbor was also taking cover and lost sight of defendant Doe. Plaintiff then heard an SUV screeching and speeding, leaving the residence. Plaintiff then entered the home of the neighbor, who informed her that he had already called police. Plaintiff informed the neighbor that it was Sean Combs who had R'd her and shot at them, but the neighbor was unaware who defendant Diddy was. Shortly thereafter, a sheriff from the Contra Costa Sheriff's Department arrived at the neighbor's home. Plaintiff identified the person who arrived at the neighbor's home posing as a Contra Costa sheriff was defendant Pelletier. So she ended up staying at the neighbor's house for some time, but she didn't really know who to trust because this person that was posing as a police officer didn't take her home, didn't take her to the hospital, didn't call for backup. So she's like, what kind of police officer is this? So she stayed at the neighbor's house for a short time. Then she went back to Shane's house so she could further look for her keys and her purse and her phone so she could leave. Shane acted as if nothing happened, and he told her that she wasn't in any condition to drive home and she needed to sleep it off. He left the house, but the next morning he came back. He gave her keys, her purse, and her phone, and so she left. Now, she ended up calling her primary care physician and asked for an HIV and STD test in fear that she may have contracted something. Now, she tried to continue on with her life, but she was in fear that something would happen to not only her, but also her family, because you remember, Big Homie CC showed her that video outside of her sister's home. Now, she says miraculously before the attack, Shane began driving a new car, and she believes that car was payment for what later transpired. Now, she went to the hospital and told the staff there what happened, but she did not mention Diddy's name. Now, a different police department came to the hospital and took a statement, and she also filed a police report with the Walnut Creek Police Department and left her underwear as proof. But since then, she has not been able to retrieve the police report or get any resolve from either police department. So let's get into plaintiffs John and Jane Doe, who are mother and son. Now, plaintiffs were taken from their Las Vegas residence by defendant Pelletier, that's the fake police officer, as they walked to their vehicle. Defendant Pelletier put a pow-pow to plaintiff John Doe's back and instructed him to get into a black SUV regarding extraditing plaintiff for warrants to California. Now, plaintiff did not have any warrants nor convictions. Plaintiff demanded to be shown the warrants, and defendant Pelletier refused and threatened to shoot plaintiff if they protested further. In the back of the SUV was defendant Valdez. Defendant was unknown to plaintiff at the time. Defendant dressed in dark clothes and instructed plaintiffs not to look at him. Plaintiffs were then transported to what they believed was defendant Pelletier's residence at blank 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 Bay Street, Las Vegas. Plaintiff was ordered inside and brought into the living room and forced to sit on the couch and were physically restrained. Plaintiffs demanded to speak to their attorney, which was refused, ignored, or met with threats of violence. It became obvious to plaintiffs that this was not a legal arrest and that Pelletier was acting outside of colors of law. At some point thereafter, plaintiffs were ordered to the back of a large black SUV. Defendant Gonzalez was given the keys to plaintiff's vehicle, a SUV, to follow behind the SUV. Defendant Gonzalez and Pelletier had a list, which upon information and belief was a list of safe houses which they could allow parties a safe respite undetected. Defendant Pelletier appeared to be in charge, and he and defendant Valdez were both giving out orders to the other co-conspirator defendant. Plaintiffs overhear repeated conversations in the vehicle while being kidnapped and transported about following protocol made by defendant Pelletier to others. Upon information and belief, this protocol was agreed upon codes, including the use of communication apps like WhatsApp and or Snapchat, satellite phone, and referring to other co-conspirator defendants by their middle names. It was apparent to plaintiffs this was a professional operation syndicate. Plaintiffs were then trafficked from Las Vegas, Nevada to various locations throughout California. The first location plaintiffs were able to identify was in Danville, California. In the convoy with the SUV plaintiffs were placed in also included plaintiff's SUV that was driven by defendant Gonzalez. Upon information and belief, defendant KK was in another SUV, part of the convoy. At some point, defendant Gonzalez complained he was having trouble keeping up with the convoy of black SUVs because the SUV ran poorly. Plaintiff alleged the convoy drive was for numerous hours, but the exact time was uncertain as they were unable to keep adequate track of time. The next location plaintiffs were taken among the safe houses on their route to an unknown destination was Blank Way, Danville, California, 94506. Plaintiffs heard some altercation with the owners of the home not wanting to be involved with defendant's scheme. Plaintiffs attempted to plead with the owners for help and could not understand why they wouldn't heed plaintiffs' cries for help. Plaintiff heard the owners speak a foreign language, which they believed was Farsi. Upon information and belief, this location was approximately 20 miles from the home in Orinda where plaintiff Parham was assaulted. During the transportation of plaintiff across state lines, they were given water to drink, which plaintiffs believed was drug. Defendant Valdez would provide plaintiff the water, which after drinking, plaintiff would feel slightly euphoric, dizzy, and then sick. Defendant Valdez would demand plaintiffs drink the water, but they refused and or fake consumption. Plaintiffs were forced to listen to a device with music similar to a device associated with defendant KK's nonprofit organization, Music Beats Heart, in order to prevent plaintiffs from eavesdropping on the defendant's conversation. At certain times, the music stopped playing and plaintiff John Doe was able to get the earbuds partially out of one ear without defendants noticing to hear conversations about the plans they had for plaintiffs. Plaintiffs were taken to another location at Blank Boulevard in El Cerrito, California. Plaintiffs were able to keep track of their locations by remembering cross streets when they were finally let out of the vehicle for stops. At this location, plaintiffs observed an RV recreational vehicle arrive at the residence. During this stop is when plaintiffs noticed defendant KK was part of the convoy. At this stop, plaintiffs overheard KK being referred to as her code name, believed to be her middle name, Natasha, discussing visiting the UC Berkeley campus as defendants seemed very familiar with the area and familiar with the city. Upon information and belief, this location was approximately 7 miles from the home in Orinda where plaintiff was assaulted. Plaintiffs were taken to another location at the Beacon Grand Hotel, Sir Francis Drake. Defendant Shane worked at the hotel as a manager. Plaintiffs were taken into the hotel through what appeared to be a side entrance by defendant Valdez, Pelletier, and Gonzalez. Defendant Pelletier told the co-conspirator defendants he would stay at a different hotel nearby so it wouldn't be linked to him. Once inside the hotel, plaintiffs were beaten and drugged by defendant Valdez and Gonzalez. Plaintiffs pleaded with Valdez and Gonzalez to be released and for mercy. Defendant Valdez and Gonzalez instructed plaintiffs to sign paperwork at gunpoint. When plaintiffs refused, defendant Gonzalez would pistol whip plaintiffs on the back of their heads. Defendant Gonzalez eventually gave plaintiffs a drink, which caused them to pass out. Plaintiffs spent the night at the hotel with defendant Gonzalez and Valdez taking turns watching them. The next morning, plaintiffs were restrained and bound by their hands in front and were placed into a vehicle. Plaintiffs then saw defendants Jaguar and Helena, that's Jaguar Wright. Upon information and belief, defendants Jaguar and Helena were in a small sedan light-colored white or beige. Plaintiffs were then transported to the location of plaintiff Parham's brutal assault on Loma Vista Drive by defendant Jaguar and Helena. Defendant Helena was the driver and defendant Jaguar was the passenger. Defendant Helena warned plaintiff if they tried to escape or run that she would have to shoot you. Defendant Helena also warned plaintiff not to throw up in her vehicle, saying you better not throw up in my car or get sick. Defendant Helena mentioned having two partners as backup who were bounty hunters. Plaintiffs were familiar with defendant Helena as she had filed a lawsuit against superstar singer Michael Jackson in 2005 and filed a creditor's claim against the Jackson estate upon his untimely demise in 2009. Plaintiffs were familiar with defendant Helena from her previous Michael Jackson lawsuit and had previously met with defendant at her home in West Hollywood to determine the credibility of her claims and if they were similar in nature to plaintiffs. Plaintiffs had reported defendant Helena multiple times to the LA and OC FBI field offices for her role in the crime syndicate with defendants Pelletier, Valdez, and other individuals. Plaintiffs attempted to make conversation with defendant Helena in which she admitted she was the same person who plaintiffs had met with previously. Defendant Jaguar, aggravated, stated, "You let them know who you are? That's really great." Plaintiffs noticed defendant had large brown bags and manila envelopes full of cash that was banded. It appeared they were separating the large sums of cash to distribute as they were placing cash into the manila folders. Defendant Jaguar discussed with defendant Helena how the party started the first black-owned network. Upon information and belief, plaintiffs believed the network to be Revolt TV. Defendant Jaguar and Defendant Helena discussed the other co-conspirators, but referred to them by their middle names: Natasha, Defendant KK, Pedro, Defendant Gonzalez, Lyra, Defendant Valdez, Cornelius, Defendant Odell, and Larry, shortened to Lawrence, Defendant Pelletier. When Defendant Jaguar said Cornelius, it upset Defendant Helena, who said that Defendants Odell and Druski were her clients and nothing better happened to them, and plaintiffs better not say anything about them or she would have plaintiffs unalive. Defendant Jaguar then told plaintiffs they were being taken to meet John. Plaintiffs now know that was referring to Defendant Diddy. When defendants arrived with plaintiffs at the Loma Vista location, it appears as they were waiting and coordinating for others to arrive. A large sedan arrived and plaintiffs were placed in the back with Defendant Valdez. Defendant Pelletier was driving. Plaintiffs then arrived at a short driveway curb. Plaintiffs remember looking for intersecting street signs at this location and found blank, a dead-end street off of Loma Vista Drive. Plaintiff John Doe repeated the name of the streets to himself, so he remembered and was able to whisper into Jane Doe's ear to remember the intersecting street name blank. Plaintiffs believed this was the home they were to be murdered in and tried to devise a plan for escape. Plaintiffs were brought into the house and into the kitchen, where they were watched by Defendant Gonzalez. Plaintiffs repeated their pleas to Defendant Gonzalez to be released and for mercy, which he replied there's nothing he could do. Plaintiffs could hear other people inside the home and tried to listen to understand what was happening, which included a woman's scream. Eventually, plaintiffs were led deeper into the home, where they encountered more individuals, including Defendant Diddy. Plaintiffs observed several individuals gathered around a bed while Defendant Gonzalez and Valdez stood outer guard. Defendant Jaguar told plaintiffs he wants something you have. If I were you, I'd figure out what it is really fast. That he, defendant, was referring to is believed to be Defendant Diddy. Shortly after, Defendant Druski appeared wearing a vest and shorts, and he engaged in conversation with plaintiffs. Plaintiffs tried to appeal to defendant by talking about the music industry, and defendant instructed plaintiffs that they should cooperate. Plaintiffs described what they observed during the assault of Plaintiff Parham after the interaction with Defendant Druski. Plaintiffs observed Plaintiff Parham having an IUD forcefully placed in her female regions by Defendant KK with the assistance of Defendant Brandy. Plaintiffs heard Defendant KK make a remark about how Plaintiff Jane Doe would not need an IUD because of her age. Not KK with the ageism. While hearing Plaintiff Parham scream in agony during the forceful IUD insertion, Plaintiff Jane Doe yelled, "Stop hurting her!" Plaintiffs observed Defendant Shane place a pillow over Plaintiff Parham's face, basically obstructing her breathing, and Plaintiff Jane Doe yelled for them to stop or that she will be unalive. Plaintiff Jane Doe believes Plaintiff Parham did lose consciousness because she became limp and unresponsive. Defendant Diddy instructed Defendant Valdez to shut her up, and Defendant Valdez hit Plaintiff Jane Doe with the handle of his firearm. Plaintiff John Doe witnessed Plaintiff Parham being assaulted by the remote, and when he tried to say something, Plaintiff was told to shut up or they would put the remote in him next. Plaintiff John Doe believes he heard Defendant Jaguar make remarks, "Put the remote in her. She's going to learn today," and telling Plaintiff Parham that she was going to make it worse. Plaintiffs believe the remote assault was to punish Plaintiff Parham for the IUD failure. Plaintiffs heard Defendant KK remark to Defendant Diddy and Druski that she needed to keep them sufficiently drugged and revealed a bag full of drugs and paraphernalia. Defendant KK appeared to be distributing doses to defendants, asking them their weight to administer the proper amount. At some point, Plaintiff John Doe was taken to the bathroom. While in the bathroom, he believed there may have been other tenants and began to bang on the walls, hoping someone would hear him, but the only person who heard him was Defendants Valdez and Gonzalez, who were outside keeping watch. Upon Plaintiff John Doe's return, he saw Defendant Odell. Plaintiff John Doe took immediate notice of Defendant Odell because when he took his clothes off, plaintiff remembers defendant being in great shape, especially in comparison to the naked bodies of Defendant Diddy and Druski. Plaintiff John Doe overheard Defendant Diddy and Odell discussing business and plans to have Plaintiff Parham return to New York with Defendant Odell. Plaintiff John Doe could not readily observe where Plaintiff Jane Doe was during this time. While during this time where Plaintiff Jane Doe was out of sight of Plaintiff John Doe, Plaintiff Jane Doe was being essayed by Defendant Valdez in another room. Plaintiff John Doe witnessed the gang guard Plaintiff Parham. Plaintiff Jane Doe witnessed the gang guard Plaintiff Parham. Plaintiff John Doe witnessed Defendant Druski douse Plaintiff Parham in baby oil and then jump and slid across her body. Plaintiff John Doe observed defendant Diddy and Druski manically and hysterically laughing, which plaintiff attributed to their drug use. Defendant Diddy then attempted to force plaintiff John Doe to also assault plaintiff Parham, and he refused. Defendant Diddy instructed defendant co-conspirators to throw plaintiff John Doe into the wall several times in order to get him to comply with his demands to our plaintiff Parham, which he would not comply. Defendant Diddy instructed defendant's co-conspirators to yank, grab, and pull at plaintiff John Doe's manhood violently in an effort to punish him for not participating in the gang R of plaintiff Parham. Plaintiff John Doe remembers defendant Big Homie CC saying he was going to look for pliers to use to further torture plaintiff. Plaintiff John Doe believes defendant Diddy wanted plaintiff to R plaintiff Parham so they could frame him in the event plaintiff Parham reported her assault. In an effort to get DNA from plaintiff John Doe to place on plaintiff Parham, defendant Diddy had one of the defendant co-conspirators orally copulate plaintiff John Doe to get his man juices from him, but it failed. Plaintiff Jane Doe observed defendant KK return to the room to check on plaintiff Parham and provided her an IV, telling her to breathe deeply. Plaintiff John Doe watched plaintiff Parham lose consciousness. At some point, plaintiff Jane Doe returns after defendant Diddy, Shane, Druski, Odell, KK, and others leave the room and retire to either the backyard or the upstairs patio. Plaintiffs were left alone and unattended with an unconscious plaintiff Parham. Plaintiffs were crying after observing the assault upon plaintiff Parham and began to realize this was their next chance to devise a plan for escape. Plaintiffs began looking for weapons and exit points to make their escape. Plaintiff could not find any phones or any weapons like knives in the kitchen, as it appears all the cutlery and silverware had been removed from the home. Plaintiffs were trying to act quickly while the defendants left them unattended and were outside smoking, drinking, and loudly laughing as if having a party. Plaintiffs observed others outside believed to be Diddy's sons, Christian and Quincy. Plaintiffs observed them roughhousing and practicing layup basketball moves. Plaintiffs heard defendant Diddy tell his sons to watch the gate and make sure no one left. Plaintiffs observed defendant Gonzalez outside the front door, where the front door was barricaded by yellow crime scene-like tape. The door lock was unusual as it was facing backwards, needing the key to exit. Fearing no way to escape, plaintiff Jane Doe mentioned to plaintiff John Doe that she overheard them say, "Put it on top of the refrigerator," and instructed plaintiff John Doe to check and see if there was anything on top of the refrigerator. Plaintiff John Doe found a knife on top of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Plaintiffs then heard ramblings from the room plaintiff Parham was in and went in to check on her and stop her from making too much noise that could thwart their escape plan. Plaintiffs told plaintiff Parham they weren't going to hurt her and they were here to help. Plaintiff Parham, just now coming into consciousness and being horrifically gang-ard, was upset, terrified, and unsure if plaintiffs were trying to help or were also co-conspirators. Plaintiffs eventually were able to get plaintiff Parham to calm down and listen to their escape plan. Plaintiffs told plaintiff Parham they could not find an exit to escape and needed her help to escape, otherwise they would all be unalive. Plaintiff Parham, after experiencing her ordeal with defendants, believed plaintiff and agreed to help in an escape. Plaintiffs told plaintiff Parham that they had found a knife and that her assailants were in the backyard, which was believed to be the best exit for escape. Plaintiff Parham then exited the home with the knife concealed to the backyard. Shortly thereafter, defendant KK returned and took plaintiff Jane Doe to the balcony, leaving plaintiff John Doe alone in the residence. Plaintiffs believed defendant KK did not check the residence because she believed plaintiff Parham was still unconscious. While on the balcony, defendant KK demanded plaintiff Jane Doe sign documents. When plaintiff refused, defendant yelled to at least 2 Doe bodyguards. Plaintiff would not sign and asked them to assist. Plaintiffs believed the documents were related to creditors' claims plaintiff had filed against the Michael Jackson estate. During this interaction, parties hear a gunshot, which causes everyone to run towards the backyard where the shot came from. Plaintiff John Doe, who was left alone and unattended, was able to reach the stairs where he saw plaintiff Parham with a knife, looking as if she was about to stab defendant Diddy, and he yelled out, "Do it! Stab him!" But he saw plaintiff Parham hesitate. Plaintiff John Doe observed defendant Diddy push plaintiff Parham down at the bottom of the stairs, and plaintiff John Doe believes he assisted her up. Plaintiffs were then briefly reunited, and plaintiff John Doe told plaintiff Jane Doe now was our opportunity to escape. Following plaintiff Parham, plaintiff ran out of the back gate onto the street and in the opposite direction of plaintiff Parham. Plaintiffs arrived at the house next door to the residence and banged on the door and yelled for help. The wife came out and said that she and her husband couldn't help. Plaintiff found the exchange bizarre and couldn't understand why they would not help or call 911. Plaintiffs were then able to try to hide until they saw an officer report to the location, where they attempted to speak with the officer. Before plaintiffs were able to speak to the local officer, defendant Pelletier appeared and obstructed plaintiffs from speaking to the responding officer, telling the responding officer a federal investigation was ongoing and not to interfere. Defendant Pelletier told the officer to turn off his body camera. Defendant Pelletier told the officer he was working on a case for drug trafficking and had the house under surveillance and will report later to the local precinct. Defendant Pelletier referred to plaintiffs and plaintiff's Parham as suspects and said they were homeless. When plaintiffs tried to refute these claims by defendant Pelletier, they were threatened and told to shut up and remain quiet. Defendant Gonzalez then transports and removes plaintiffs from the interaction with defendant Pelletier and the responding officer. Defendant Gonzalez placed plaintiffs in another vehicle, which was hard to see due to the darkness. Plaintiff Jane Doe pleaded with defendant Gonzalez to let them go, and she would not tell. In a last-ditch effort, plaintiff told defendant she overheard defendant Jaguar and Helena say they were not going to pay him and that there was not enough money for him. Unbeknownst to plaintiffs, defendant Jaguar and Helena were in a nearby vehicle. Defendant Gonzalez exited the vehicle and went to the vehicle with defendant Jaguar and Helena and confronted them about what plaintiff Jane Doe said. Defendant Gonzalez returned to the vehicle where plaintiffs were being held, seemingly confirming what plaintiff Jane Doe said because plaintiff heard him use the Spanish term mayate, which is often used as a slur towards black people. Defendant Gonzalez then walked plaintiff to a nearby street where the SUV was parked and gave plaintiffs the keys to the vehicle and released them. Plaintiffs then arrived at Blank, the main road that leads to I-24 highway, and asked another commuter the nearest police station, as plaintiffs did not have any phones and their vehicle did not have GPS. They were given instructions, they were close, and how to proceed to the police station. Plaintiffs arrived to the police station at 22 Orinda Way, Orinda, California. Plaintiff John Doe walked in the police station with the intention of filing a police report, but remembered overhearing conversation from the defendants during their transport when defendants believed he could not hear them, that if plaintiffs ever reported the incident, they would be deemed crazy and non-believable. Plaintiff John Doe was also concerned about the exchange with the responding officer on the scene and how he refused to listen to his plea then. Plaintiff John Doe then only briefly spoke to someone at the front desk about filing a report and took a business card. Now, I do want to say all of these people are innocent until they're proven guilty in a court of law. But I do want to say that she states that defendants Odell and Druski received benefits related to their celebrity, specifically defendant Druski, who had a television show on Revolt TV network. They believe that Valdez, Jaguar, Pelletier, and Helena received and handled cash payments on behalf of the enterprise. And the defendants willfully ignored the dangers of defendant Diddy's conduct and pattern of harassment as assault, abuse, misconduct solely for their own personal economic benefit. I'm not sure how this case is going to go over, but right now it's not looking good for your boy Diddy. What I need to do is hear from you. What do you think about everything going on with Diddy? What do you think about these new co-conspirators? Leave a comment and you know how we do. We'll talk about it down below. Talk to you guys later. Bye.